About 10 years ago, I went with a friend of mine to the downtown studio of a painter named Mary Abbott, who was a close friend of Willem de Kooning, who is mentioned in the Mark Stevens biography on de Kooning, which is a good book if you've not read it. And even then, she was probably in her early 80s, in this cavernous, dimly lit loft, just clotted with stuff, with books, and there were cats running all over the place, and paintings strewn all about, including some of his. And I remember sitting down with her asking specifically about some of de Kooning's mediums, especially in the early years when he was really poor, when he was eating ketchup packets for dinner. It was inventiveness through desperation. And she mentioned that he would mix kerosene, lighter fluid, gasoline, really scary things into his paint, especially considering he was likely smoking at the time. Motor oil. All things to extend the viscosity and the fluidity and freeze the velocity of some of those marks. I don't know if any of those paintings survived. I myself have tried motor oil and a number of other things, but I thought with that image in mind, I would talk a little bit about some of the mediums that I do use. Many people have written asking me to talk a little bit more about mediums that I use. And the medium I was taught originally was just about half linseed oil, half paint thinner, which is a pretty all-purpose medium. I do use linseed oil quite a bit. If I'm going to use paler, lighter colors, I generally will go to something like safflower oil, walnut oil, or poppy oil, which tend to yellow less. They also dry a bit slower, which is an advantage if you're doing wet-on-wet painting, which I like to do. I do observe fat over lean in that I will often start just with paint thinner, very lean, no medium at all. Then gradually I'll introduce my mediums as I go in the proportion of medium to paint thinner, eventually adding with all medium and very little paint thinner in my mixing. A product that I like a lot is Gamblin's Galkyd, which is an alkyd resin. It has a very sticky, honey-like, viscous quality. And it dries quickly, and it also dries very shiny. And you can control that. You can slow down the drying time if you add a little bit of sun-thickened linseed oil or stand oil. And you can also thin it down with either straight terps or a little bit of linseed oil. And in full disclosure, I have done ads for Gamblin in magazines, but that's because I use these products, and they're very, very good mediums. There's something called Liquin, which many painters use, which is kind of an all-purpose medium. It's okay for glazing. I find it clouds when it dries a little bit, so I do not use that much Liquin. Gamblin also makes another thing called Neo McGilt, which is his modern day version of Marroget medium, which is again is a very velvety, smooth, it gives the paint a great deal of fluidity. And it also is good for creating sort of diaphanous veneers, for spreading out the liquid effects of paint. I mix all my mediums in these Chinese food containers, chow fan, egg foo young, lo mein. And I find that these are great, nice and deep, and I can get nice generous amounts of medium as I go along. And then there's the question of varnishing in the end. I find in the last 10 or so years I'm doing less and less varnishing in the final stages of the painting. Generally for a varnish, for a picture varnish, you want to wait between 2 and 3, sometimes 5 months. You want the paint to be really, really set and really dry. Walter Sickert used to say, in the painting, is it going to be fresh or pickled, meaning varnished or unvarnished? I find less and less that I do actual final varnishes. Also, if you work with things like Galkyd, which has a great deal of shine in it from the very get-go, you will get nice shiny effects in paint if you want that. And if you want to lessen the shine factor in a paint, in a medium, you can mix cold wax medium with it. And a lot of times I will mix a couple of drops of cold wax into these other mixtures to bring it down in luster, give it a nice kind of flat quality. Also a bit of kind of a cloudy, again, a diaphanous quality, which I find useful for these sort of overall glazes and these veils of color that I tend to use in my paintings as well. I'm often asked if I can talk about how I create the very thin veiled passages in my paintings. And the answer is, through a multitude of processes over a very long period of time, generally 6 to 9 months, using very, very little medium, if any, in the beginning, just terps and a little bit of pigment, very thin veiled washes of color, allowed to dry, then sanding, then repeating that glazy layer, rubbing out with rags and large brushes, sanding, and then repeating over and over again. Occasionally adding a little bit of titanium white, which gives sort of a milky paleness to the colors. And then as I'm working my way out, increasing the ratio of medium to pigment, and then finally adding sometimes a little drop or two of cold wax medium, which gives sort of a low luster, satiny, waxy finish, which I can then go back in and buff. And these areas these diaphanous areas, deliquescent, as if something's melting or disappearing before your eyes, ambiguous in the romantic sense, I think are all strengthened because they're seen in relationship to the opposite, to very thick, aggressive, visceral oil paint. And a lot of times in a painting, if you want to present one position, that position is far more potent if you see it in relation to its opposite. If you're going to use curves, then have something hard edge or angular near that. If you're going to use a lot of warm color, pair it next to something that's cooler. If you're going to use something that's resolute, then try it near something that's more softer edge. If you're going to try something that's large in scale, then often answer it with something very small in scale. And this notion of atmosphere and of soft edges and diaphanous qualities of light, I want to have framed by a painter who I've been thinking about lately, who I've loved for many years, named Washington Allston, who lived from 1779 to 1843. And I first discovered his work in the Gibbs Museum of Art in Charleston when I was 17 or 18 years old, and I've loved it ever since, especially his later landscapes. Allston is often referred to as the American Titian because of his love and interest in the Venetian colorists. And he's also a fellow South Carolina boy. He was born and raised in Georgetown County, about half an hour south of where I come from. And he recounts in his writings his love of that place, of that landscape. He talks about it as strengthening his love of the wild and marvelous. He recounts stories of being in landscapes with twisted vines and branches. And he also references stories being told to him about witches and hags and all the superstitions that are redolent in that very specific part of the Lowcountry. I remember as a kid, I would take big handfuls of pluff mud, which is sticky, gooey, kind of silvery gray, raw umber colored mud, splatting it down on the dock in front of me, letting it bake in the sun for a few minutes, and then putting little bits of grass and colored paper on top of that, then another scoopful of mud, pushing it in different directions, revealing the layers that came before it. I think all early indicators in my investment in process, in the thick stickiness of oil paint, and my love of material. Allston often wrote about his interest in the Venetian colorists, and I'll read a little passage here in his writings. I'm paraphrasing. Titian, Veronese, and Tintoretto absolutely enchanted me, for they took away all sense of subject. When I stood before them, I thought of not a subject, but the gorgeous concert of colors, or rather the indefinite forms of pleasure with which they filled my imagination. And he goes on. It was the poetry of color which I felt, procreative in its nature. And here's the real kicker. Giving birth to 1,000 things the eye cannot see. And that's the part that just drives me crazy. When is that moment when exterior suddenly becomes interior? That split second when communal experience becomes private experience. That's the place I want to operate in. That's the moment I want to freeze in my paintings. That interface between interior, exterior, and that shifting forth between the two.